Okay, so we're going to be looking here at volume and rest periods as it relates to the resistance training program design. So some of the things here, again, are going to seem fairly basic, but for the most part, it's going to kind of give you an idea. One is to more ways to kind of look at tracking volume, and then we'll talk about some rest periods as kind of outlined in the text. And what typically gets utilized, and mention some things that have maybe even evolved a little bit regarding rest periods. So looking at volume, so volume just looks at the total amount of weight that's lifted in a training session. So as I said, when you're looking particularly at your larger compound joint movements, your main lifts, you may want to track how much weight they're doing with that as kind of a way to look at their overall workload. A set, as we all know, is just a group of repetitions, and there's various ways that we could kind of manipulate sets. Again, if you're talking just a typical set and rep scheme, for instance, if you do 4 sets of 10 repetitions, you're doing 10 repetitions in each individual set with rest periods. As we'll see when we get into some other coursework, there's various ways to manipulate different types of sets, but typically, again, for most people, just the conventional set rep schemes tend to work. Repetition volume looks at the total number of repetitions performed. So it's fairly easy to determine because you just basically take your sets times reps and add them all up throughout the course of an entire session, and you'll get your repetition volume. Load volume is basically going to be looking at the total number of sets multiplied by the repetitions, then multiplying that by the weight lifted per session. Okay, so the load volume is basically looking at now including the weight into the equation. And then you can actually figure out the average weight lifted per repetition if you take your load volume and divide it by your repetition volume. Okay, so that's something. So these are all different ways that you could kind of track various types of volume. And again, these are the things that you at least want to look at as you're kind of progressing an individual through their resistance training program. Now, looking at some different aspects regarding, the amount of work getting done and things like that. So we've looked at like multiple versus single set schemes, and you don't see a whole lot of single set schemes. There are a couple people out there that have some things. Dr. Yesis has a pretty interesting 1x20 program that he does for youth athletes, which is very good, and we'll kind of talk about how that could work into here. Because we have seen improvements in single set programs. In other words, just basically doing one single set per exercise, not including like maybe a warm-up set, but basically looking at working sets. Okay, so you may still do like a warm-up set, but for the most part you do just one single work set. However, as we find, and this shouldn't come to a surprise to anybody, for particular aspects of training, eventually you're going to need higher volumes. Okay, so I would even say there's times where even single set lower volume programs can be used with more advanced individuals, but overall you're going to look at wanting to do slightly higher volumes of training. So again, initiating a program with them, they also believe that initiating a program with a multiple set will typically yield better long-term results. Okay, so there's a couple things to look at there. But, again, the bottom line is eventually you're going to typically need higher volumes to work. Now, one important thing to note is that, and we've actually seen more done with this recently, is that you don't necessarily have to perform all exercises until failure, particularly if you're using a multiple set scheme. So if you are doing, say, like, an exercise for 3 sets of 10 repetitions, you don't have to take you don't have to fail at 10 reps. You can actually have a couple reps left in reserve. As a matter of fact, and this isn't in your textbook, if you're within what we would call like a 3 reps in reserve. So basically say, you do a set and you could have done anywhere from 1 to 3 more reps. That for the most part, if you're doing a high enough volume, you can actually still get a lot of benefits from that. And then there's also the, the less of a chance of overtraining and kind of beating up your nervous system, and just in general, even structurally being able to recover better. So it is important to note that if you're doing now, you may have to work to more failure if you're doing lower volume. If you're doing lower volume, and again, you're probably only going to want to do that for a certain period of time. To get the most out of that, you will have to go to failure. But if you're doing a multiple set scheme, you definitely do not have to take every set to failure. And in some instances, for better long-term results, you're better off not doing that. So training status and goals, again, a beginner overall typically is still going to need less volume because, again, just anything that they get is going to pretty much for the most part create an adaptation. And that's where I got into discussing earlier that 1x20 program. Basically, they do one set of an exercise, 20 repetitions, and they see benefits with that when you're talking young kids. So again, basically kind of like leaving those like more advanced adaptations for later on in training. So again, strength and power, we've kind of talked about. This is kind of a little bit of a review because we talked about this with the discussion on loading. So again, typically for strength, 2 to 6 sets, 2 to 6 reps. Power, 3 to 5 sets, 1 to 5 reps. Again, the idea with power being that you're using percentages that will allow those repetitions to be of adequate speed. That's the important thing there. Okay, so strength, that could be like a maximal, whatever you're doing. If you're doing, say, a set of you're doing a double, it could be a slow double with the heavy weight, but you don't want to do that in the case of working with power. For hypertrophy, approximately 3 to 6 sets. And again, it's not to say that you can't do 2, but we're just giving some general guidelines here. But notice I said how the reps can be higher. So another thing that we kind of talked about is that, I gave some of the more recent research showing that you can actually go up to 30 repetitions and get muscle hypertrophy and get a significant amount of muscle hypertrophy from that. Remember, I said some of the caveat to that obviously is you have to look at the fatigue of an exercise where you're doing 30 reps. So yes, you can do a 30 rep set of squats and get hypertrophy out of it. However, just sort of the fatigue you're going to get and the amount of weight you can use relative to that might not be worth it to do that a whole lot, as opposed to maybe a smaller muscle group or maybe a less complex exercise where 30 reps can be achieved. You're still going to obviously be fatigued from it, but it won't be quite as much. And then obviously muscular endurance. And again, these are the guidelines that we look at with this. And again, so obviously here you'll get muscle endurance, but as I've just talked about, this higher repetition scheme will also yield results with hypertrophy. So, here kind of getting 2 different things. And there's different ways to also, again, there's ways to kind of do some more aerobic adaptations at the muscle through, various types of aerobic circuits. We're not going to get into that probably in this class, but we'll discuss that in the program design class. So your rest periods. Again, your variables when you look at your rest periods. So you want to be looking at how much the nervous system is getting stressed. Again, the nervous system is going to require slightly longer rest intervals. So typically what you will do is for strength and power, typically longer rest intervals. Speed strength exercises, you can shorten that. So I had mentioned the dynamic effort method in the previous discussion in looking at methods of strength training. The dynamic effort method, what you'll tend to do, and if you see most people conventionally using that method, they will actually take slightly shorter rest intervals, but you're still getting adequate rest to where you can still express power. So typically even sometimes you'll see like closer to a minute in that regard. But, most of the time in a lot of other strength power types of exercises, you're going to be closer to 2 to 5 minutes. The idea with doing that with the speed strength is that it will also help with work capacity. The key being is you just want to make sure the bar speed, if the bar speed still stays fast, so if they do say 10 sets of 2 repetitions, with the appropriate loading, and you're taking a minute between sets, as long as they're maintaining bar speed, which they should, they're getting a work capacity benefit from that. So in those cases, that's kind of where sort of the exception could take place. For hypertrophy, 30 seconds to a minute and a half. So again, this is a recommendation in your textbook. What I will also tell you is here's another thing where, some more recent research has kind of shown, and this is important to note. So again, and I'll kind of differentiate this for what you're getting asked for on an exam. But more recent research has shown in some cases, like particularly with like larger exercises. So again, take for instance like an exercise that's more fatiguing, like a squat or a deadlift, when you're doing it for hypertrophy purposes. That if you take even upwards to 3 minutes, that's still going to be okay for hypertrophy. Obviously the benefit to the shorter rest intervals is that the hormone response and everything that does occur, does assist with hypertrophy. However, one thing they looked at, particularly with the bigger exercises, is you're able to use more load, and by virtue of that, it's creating more in the potential to create more mechanical tension within the muscle. So sidebar, again, that you can do upwards to around 3 minutes as it relates to hypertrophy. Now, obviously, when you're talking muscular endurance, there, and again, you'll still actually get some, hypertrophy benefits still from this, obviously, but typically you're going to be less than 30 seconds. Now, if you're going to do power endurance, and this is kind of what you'll get a little bit out of what I talked about earlier. So I guess in some ways, conventionally, we do apply this. You can go slightly longer, and part of the reason why you want to go slightly longer for power endurance is because of the fact that you have the power element. So you still want, we all have done things for endurance purposes. You kind of, again, the intensity of what you're doing relatively slows down. For power endurance purposes, you want to make sure that you kind of are a little more fresh, because you want to be able to express a certain degree of power. So that kind of wraps up this talk. So, pretty basic, but again, here's your learning outcomes, and we'll talk a little bit more about, how we should kind of use this, and again, kind of thinking about how we can use this, some of these concepts, compound primary lifts versus auxiliary lifts, how we can maybe do things differently with each one of those.